Some things are impossible to miss, like an elephant in the room, or a bull in a china shop, or this season's amazing offers, brought to you by PayPal. Discover offers from hundreds of brands like Viator, Allbirds, and Tory Burch right in the PayPal app. Save an offer before you check out with PayPal and earn unlimited rewards. Download the PayPal app to get started. Terms and exclusions apply. See paypal.com/rewards terms.
Good morning. It's Wednesday, the 20th of May, and this is the Brussels Playbook Podcast. The vibe in Brussels today is not so fast. The EU has been on a push to slash red tape, but now it realises perhaps it's been a bit too hasty and is calling in the experts. Also on the podcast today, the EU is considering making the period between needing to renew sanctions on countries like Russia longer. That's another side effect, a positive side effect, as much as Brussels sees it, of Orbán losing the election in Hungary. And we talk peacocks. In Italy, proper peacocks are becoming political peacocks. We give you a précis. I'm Ian Wishart, and with me today is Politico's senior finance reporter, Kathryn Carlson. Hello, Katie.
Hi, Ian.
And you said you were very enthusiastic about talking about peacocks, didn't you?
I would like to clarify, I said once in one meeting that peacocks are cool.
Well, given you normally write about market integration supervision package, I think I can understand why you see peacocks as being cool.
They're majestic birds. Who doesn't like peacocks? Apart from the people we're going to talk about later.
We'll find out who doesn't, exactly. But let's start with a more serious story as our first story today. It's about the inner workings of the EU, and actually it's really interesting because it shows how big political initiatives can sometimes fall foul of technical realities. As you know, Katie, a big thing since Ursula von der Leyen was reappointed as Commission President a couple of years ago is the Commission's campaign to get rid of red tape. So the plan has been to strip away a lot of EU rules, to simplify them, make things easier for business. The idea being to create this sort of more dynamic economy that can compete with the likes of the US and China. All of that sounds good in theory. In practice, that's not been so easy. Katie, do you want to, before we go into what's actually maybe going wrong, talk about some examples of where this deregulation is supposed to be happening?
Oh, yeah. Ever since von der Leyen came back around again, we've all been on board the omnibus, whether we want to or not.
Yeah, the omnibus is a ridiculous piece of EU jargon.
It just means you're changing a bunch of laws, essentially.
Okay.
That's been the aim of it. So some of the ones that the Commission's put out this time around have been a push to loosen water and chemical and permitting laws to allow for building more new mines. They have wanted to weaken rules on cancer-linked chemicals in cosmetics.
Already I'm seeing why some of this might be controversial.
And they want to make it easier to kill wildlife to build industrial projects.
Well, what a surprise that maybe some of this hasn't been quite so easy. One of the priorities of this red tape slashing was that it had to be done fast. That was sort of the whole raison d'etre here. The Commission didn't want the process of getting rid of rules to be bogged down in its own red tape. But that's kind of been the problem because the member states formed this squad of diplomats, but they intentionally didn't include experts in this group. Our colleague Marianne Gross has been reporting on this today. Katie, tell us about this group.
Yeah, so it turns out that simplifying is actually quite complicated.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole idea behind this was that you take away the red tape slashing responsibilities from the kinds of people who are normally writing the laws, the national diplomats, so that they're not too bogged down in the details, so that they don't have pet issues, so that they don't get, dragged down by all of the
You can see if you were in charge of drawing up the rules, you wouldn't necessarily be the best person to get rid of the rules.
Exactly. It makes total sense on paper that you put it in the hands of people who are a bit more removed and have a bit more vision and can just get rid of the damn stuff. Except it hasn't exactly worked out that way. So the people who are in charge of it, it's a small group of European diplomats. These are the sort of right-hand men of EU ambassadors that are called the Antici groups. Experts weren't looped into that group so that technical discussions wouldn't slow things down. And as Marianne reports, it turns out that a lot of these are very complicated and important regulations that actually could have benefited from the input of experts.
Yeah, especially when it comes to big controversial things like the impact on human health. And some of those examples you gave earlier, Katie, shows why those alarm bells started ringing, because they were rules that were being stripped away that had this effect on health or because of environmental concerns.
Yeah, I mean, cancer, pesticides, wildlife, this is the kind of important stuff that you don't want to mess around with just for the sake of shortening the process. And to add to all of that, the negotiators are under a time crunch. There's pressure from EU leaders to agree on all of these omnibus proposals. There's 10 of them by the end of this year. So they're always on this constant tightrope of working fast, but also trying to think about the proper ramifications of the deregulation that they're doing.
And as Marianne is reporting, actually, in the end, this group, the Antici group, has called in experts after all.
Yeah, so Marianne spoke to 5 diplomats who said that the group actually is relying on experts back home, and that the delegations want backup from their governments to examine all of the proposals. So slightly contradictory to the initial aims.
Yeah, so the reason we're talking about this, I think, is because it's a really good example of how, as I said, these big political initiatives are sometimes more complicated than at first they might seem. And you have these big announcements in the Commission, and the Commission President announces them. And then, as usual, the EU works in mysterious ways and actually can be quite difficult. But it's a really good, if you're interested in the way that EU policy is made and also how EU politics gets reflected in policy, it's a really interesting story to read out on our website today. Also today, Katie, we're going to talk about sanctions. Obviously, it's been in the news quite a lot. Zoya and Nick on Monday talked about how Russia's often managing to circumvent EU sanctions. Nevertheless, the EU is still forging ahead with what it calls its 21st package. So that's like the latest round of sanctions on Russia. Our colleague Bjarke Smith-Meyer actually is writing a story today about how the process could change, isn't he?
Yeah, so he's written about how EU leaders are talking about changing the time frame for how often they renew these sanctions. It's been received wisdom until now that the sanctions are usually renewed every 6 months.
I think people outside of the EU who are just used to working with national governments might be quite surprised at that. I mean, normally you're used to governments saying, okay, we're putting sanctions on people, but because of how the EU works and it's made up of 27 national governments, you actually have to have these milestones, these times where people say, actually, let's think about this again. Are we still all okay with this?
Exactly. Everybody has to agree on it, and everybody has to keep agreeing on it, essentially, for those sanctions to stay.
And it only takes one country, doesn't it, to say, actually, I don't agree to this, all these sanctions being renewed, and then they all fall apart, they all collapse.
Exactly. And that's what we've seen plenty of times over the last few years from small groups of countries led by Orbán. I mean, it's incredible leverage to be able to sit at a table of 27 leaders and say, I'm going to screw all of your plans for all of your massive sanctions packages. I mean, we're up to 20 packages at this point. It's a huge amount of leverage to be able to hold in your hand every 6 months if you want to. And they definitely made the most of that before Orbán was ousted.
Yeah, so we've talked about so much about what's happened since Viktor Orbán has stopped being Prime Minister of Hungary, and this is just another side effect of that. It's actually now the EU can sit down and say, actually, do we really want to have to renew sanctions every 6 months? And as Bjarke was reporting, they're looking at doing that every year.
Every year instead. And that will be discussed at the European Council in June if it's going to happen. It's a possibility. We'll have to see what actually plays out at that discussion.
There's sort of a lot of benefits to that for leaders. Bjarke is talking about how actually it's quite a big burden administratively for the EU to have to do this every 6 months. It's a big political thing, and it's such a lot of tension every 6 months to say, oh, we're going to have to renew sanctions. So prolonging it to a year is actually, you can see why that's quite beneficial, can't you?
Especially now that the Commission is continuing to work on more sanctions packages against Russia. They've got all this other sanctions policy work in the pipeline. It basically, as we were talking about before, just makes everything a lot simpler.
But also for Ukraine, for example, it creates a lot of uncertainty every 6 months. It doesn't know exactly what the EU strategy is going to be.
And it's not only about the sanctions themselves, it's about the other policies that have been brought to the table to use as leverage in return for continuing sanctions.
So even this, though, would have to be done by unanimity. All 27 countries would have to agree that the sanctions renewal period would be a year rather than 6 months. Still no guarantee that would be the case. We know that Slovakia and Czechia, for example, are still a little bit uncertain just, whether they would sign up to it. So having Orbán removed helps, but it's not necessarily a fait accompli yet, is it?
Yeah, I mean, Orbán was the trailblazer for this. He was often bringing other countries along with him. It's going to be an open question once we get to June of how much those other countries might want to pipe up and try to preserve that leverage for themselves.
Yeah. So just before we stop talking about this, just let's mention that there is this 21st package of sanctions on Russia. The plan is to target things like Russian banks, financial institutions, firms selling stolen Ukrainian grain, could take aim at the Russian defense industry. They're things that the EU found quite difficult to do while Orbán was still in charge.
Yep, and we're expecting that possibly in late June or early July.
Lovely, Katie. So shall we talk about peacocks? It's the moment you've been waiting for.
I never don't want to talk about peacocks, Ian.
You're our unofficial peacock correspondent. Did I hear that right?
I reiterate, I said I like peacocks once. News travels fast around this
tell us
place.
about this story.
So, this is a story about a place called Punta Marina. It's a beach town on Italy's Adriatic coast. It's having a bit of a avian issue right now, which is that it's...
An avian issue?
An avian issue. Which is, it's completely overrun with peacocks that are apparently making everyday life unbearable for locals. They are talking about damage from droppings on their roofs and their cars, sleepless nights caused by peacock mating calls, which, thanks to the glory of an audio format, I believe we can listen to a peacock mating call right now.
Oh, no. Well, on the off chance that you use this podcast to wake up to, that's a good alarm call. Yes, so Katie. So it sounds like that, Katie, noises like that have been annoying people in this Italy town. Tell us where the politics comes in.
Can I tell you why there's so many peacocks in the town?
Do that first, yes. Tell us why there's so many peacocks in this town.
Apparently, the peacocks benefited from a COVID boom because lockdown, everybody being away in their houses, allowed for them to thrive and procreate. No one knows how they really arrived in the town in the first place, but there used to be about 10 in 2018, and there's now over 100.
It wasn't just peacocks that used to procreate during COVID lockdowns, was it?
I'm not asking about your personal life, Ian.
So why are we talking about this at Politico, where we only talk about politicians?
Because inevitably politics has got dragged into this. So, Giorgia Meloni, Prime Minister of Italy, who belongs to the Brothers of Italy party, her party is accusing the local council, which is run by the left-wing Democratic Party, of not doing anything. And they even called a public meeting on Monday, accusing the local council of failing to tackle the problem.
Well, we know that Meloni obviously has been under a lot of pressure lately, so perhaps this is a way of sort of clawing back support.
Look, you dunk on the peacocks,
peacocks have claws?
It's a vote winner.
Do peacocks have claws?
I think
Talons.
so.
Anyway, what do our listeners think? Are peacocks a menace, or are they beautiful? And what else can you say about peacocks? WhatsApp us anything about peacocks, because we'd love to read it.
I wish Brussels had more peacocks.
Do they have any peacocks?
I don't remember
I've
ever
seen a
seeing a
peacock
peacock
in
in Brussels.
Remember when we talked about, what was that animal that the Nazi raccoons?
What?
Yeah, we talked about that. You have to go back in your Spotify or your Apple app to find out when we talked about Nazi raccoons in Brussels. Anyway, Katie, yesterday we spoke about the European Order of Merit and we asked whether our listeners had anyone they'd like to nominate. Do you want to read out some of the messages we got?
Definitely. So we had a message from Giacomo from Italy, hopefully not being harassed by peacocks. He's nominated Professor Manuel de Santos. His students know him as Manolo, and he apparently has inspired generations of students in intellectual property law.
Oh, that's nice.
And Janusz from Rome says, I would award Mario Draghi. Certainly not Merkel, alas, a Putin enabler.
Oh, that's controversial, isn't
We're
it?
allowed to say that on a podcast.
Well, one of our listeners can, but obviously we can't.
And that is a direct quote from our listener and not Politico's editorial line.
Exactly. Shall we save ourselves by hearing a peacock again, and we'll see you tomorrow?